So in this video we will be taking our simulation and run some whitewater on it. For that we will be using the standard Houdini whitewater solver and all the options Houdini comes for it, and we will be looking at all the settings, see what it does, see what it doesn't do, and just get a feel for how whitewater works within Houdini by default. So for that we will be using the same simulation. Let's look at that again, which is our little torus or donut swimming around in the water and just splashing around a bit. So in order for us to set up whitewater on this, we will be using the shelf tools again, right? Because we're covering the basics, so yes, let's use what Houdini gives us. If we go up here and we select the whitewater option, it now also select a fluid to generate the whitewater, right? So we select our fluid object and hit enter, and that instantly pops us into a new dot network. So before we do anything here, let's take a step back and just take all of those new nodes and lay them out a little bit better so that we know what's going on. So Houdini put down these three new nodes for us. First the whitewater source, the whitewater sim, and then the whitewater import. Guessing whitewater import will just import our simulation and do some post-processing, so let's hide that one for now. And let's focus on our source to begin with, right? The source automatically is connected to our good old compressed cache, which is our water simulation, right? Houdini, because we selected it and we used all the tools, it knew that this node is called compressed cache and that it will be used for our whitewater emission, so it automatically brings that in. Then the next node in here, and by far the most important one, is the whitewater source. So if I visualize that and we go in a little bit, we see that there is nothing going on, right? It's completely empty. And if we middle mouse button click, there's one field and its density, but it's like tiny. So it's really strange. There's something not working quite well. Now, the reason it's not working is because our underlying simulation does not meet the default prerequisites to run a whitewater simulation with. And what I mean by that is the values are off for the emission, right? So here on the first tab under emission, we can see that there's like limited to depth and there's a maximum half width and all of that. All of this you can just leave by default. For this at least, you can play around with that a little bit later, but for now that's just all default. The important thing to look at is speed range. So if I set this to 0 and 1, all of a sudden we see that a little bit of stuff appeared, right? Like there is some volume here, and that means that we will get some emission because the whitewater solver is really particles emitted from volumes. Now every time I deal with anything that emits particles from volumes, I'm very skeptical with my visualization of this. And the reason for that is there's very low density volumes that do emit, but they show up really, really badly in the viewport. So what I normally do is I use a volume visualization node, and I plug this guy in here, and as the density field, I just give it emit, which is the field generated by the whitewater source, and we crank up the density. And oh Lord, what do we have here? We see there's a lot of areas that are emitting that we probably don't want to emit, right? All of this stuff there is probably not really what we're after. So let's just take the whitewater source and up this a little bit, speed range, so that we're left with only our particles, right? So all of this is happening and all of that is great, but still looks a bit strange and looks like we're not getting a lot of areas, right? And that is where these tabs up here come into play. The way these work, these all are settings and like individual ways of isolating particles that should be emitting whitewater. And all of them get added together, and then that needs to fall within the speed range. So the speed range is the master of all of these guys. So if I turn off all of those, acceleration, vorticity, and curvature emission, we get nothing, right? But at the same time, if I turn on vorticity and I make this, for example, 0 and 1, so almost everything emits. And now in my speed range, I can just isolate and remove that, right? So we have the speed range as the master. So all your emission needs to be at least at this point 0.9 fast and 0 and greater than 1. We probably want to have that a little bit more ranged. And on top of that, they need to have at least these vorticity values, right? So it's two-pronged layered. This isolates the vorticity, says emit from that, speed range says you're good to go or you're not good to go. So let's play around with these vorticity values a little bit so that we get something that actually makes sense to emit. Right, so let's up this a little bit and let's just lower this guy a little bit so that we get some vorticity values that make actually sense to spawn some foam from. Now let's turn off vorticity so that we can dial in the acceleration without overlapping with the vorticity. Again, all three of these filters get added together and then multiplied. So if I show both of them, I now don't know if my acceleration is doing this or if my vorticity is doing these things, right? So if I turn off the vorticity, now I know this is the only thing I'm getting from my acceleration at this point. So let's lower this a little bit. And acceleration basically grabs the differentiation in speed directions, so or speed in general. So anything that just gets faster on one turn very aggressively, that will be picked up, right? So let's say acceleration wise, these are fine. Turn that off again, go to curvature, and let's just play with this value a bit and see what we get. So curvature is basically saying what is the angle of the velocity, and the higher values means lower angles and less curved angles are allowed to emit from, and the lower this angle, the crazier basically everything needs to be, the more bent the velocity field needs to be in order for it to be picked up. So let's go a little bit, in the middle, add these to it, and now we can turn back on the acceleration and then the vorticity, and now we have this volume to emit our white water from, right? So now we have our source and that's all set up. So let's take a look at the white water solver itself. We deep dive into this guy. We see there's a white water object. The white water object has a bunch of visualization things and some bounce and friction settings, but that's it. Everything else is handled on the white water solver. So unless you're setting bounce and friction, you don't really need to touch this guy ever. It's just a container for all the data generated by the white water solver, right? So if we just hit play on this by default and take a look what happens. Boom, white water, foam, bubbles, everything generated, everything done, everything good to go, right? We can also see this is slowing down quite a bit already. That's one of the things we'll be talking a lot more next week about when we talk about custom white water solvers. The speed of this thing is not fantastic in my opinion, so that's just something to keep in mind, right? But let's take a look at all the settings and everything that's going on so that we understand what the Houdini solver does, so that we can then choose to use it when we need to use it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the limits and turn those off. It's just a lot easier to navigate if there's not a massive box in front of your face. All right, so water scale, voxel size, all of these settings. What are they? What do they do? So white water scale is the resolution of your white water. Now, the white water solver uses a pop fluid inside, which is very much based on a scale. So the bigger this value is, the bigger your shapes are going to be. The smaller this value is, the smaller your shapes are going to be. The smaller shapes you can achieve. The thing is, the smaller you go, the heavier it gets as well, right? So if we set this to 0.1, for example, and hit play on this, this simulates a lot faster, but we can also see, second, once this builds some foam right here, that what the whitewater solver does is keep all the particles separated from each other, right? That's all it wants to achieve, is equilibrium between all these points. Now, the distance of these points is defined by your whitewater scale, right? So if we lower this guy to 0.5, we will see that we get, first of all, more points, because the emission amount is bound to this value as well as getting everything spread out a lot smaller, right? So we're getting a lot more tight-knit areas, which means we can get a lot smaller details as well, right? Because the particles don't want to be so far away from each other, which is really nice. It's really neat, but it comes at a cost, right? So the more details we want to introduce, stuff like this, right, that gets expensive, and that is completely bound to the size. If we would simulate this at 1 again and look at this area over here and just let this run through for a few frames, we will see that really we won't get that level of detail, right? Now it ripped just like before, but there's no strings connecting it in between. It's just a big hole, and that's just because the particles don't want to be so close to each other to actually form these strings, right? They want to be far enough away from each other so they form big holes or big patches, like we can see here, right? Also nice, probably not what you want for a lot of the foam shots you're working on. You're looking for those small details, but it's good to know that this is all coming from the whitewater scale. So let's reset this, give it a decent scale amount, and look at the next settings. Now, voxel size is interesting. So voxel size is used by the solver internally to generate a new field on here, which is called foam density. So what it does, it actually checks how many particles are in each area and stores that as a volume, right? So that we can then later use that volume to determine shaping options of how much foam attraction do we want to run. If it's more dense in this area, which means a lot more particles being in that area, we probably want to run slightly different shaping and in the end rendering operations over this. So that is what this voxel scale is set, right? That field is being driven by that. And as we can see here, if we look at foam density, it's just hard coding this value. So this is not a multiplier based on this. It's just setting the value. So maybe we go a little bit more detailed for this to begin with. Just, if we're using this for shading, if we're using this for driving, shaping operations, we probably want to have some detail. Cool. Foam location. You can shift stuff. That's basically 0 means directly on the surface level of our simulation. You can offset that and move it higher, lower, whatever you want. Leave it at 0 for 99% of the simulations, unless you're having a very specific case, and then you can play around with this. Depth range is basically saying, well, what is the minimum value? How deep can things go? That's also used later on for some forces and for some limiting factors and all of that kind of stuff. I would also say, in most cases, you can leave that at default. Now, let's take a look at emission, right? Again, we're feeding this a volume, and what we're getting out is a bunch of particles, which means Houdini is doing a lot of stuff internally to actually emit things for us, right? So now here we have an emission amount, we have velocity offsets, velocity multipliers, maximum speeds, and lifespans, right? So the emission amount by default is kind of bound to the whitewater scale up here, which means if I go low res on this, right, so we get bigger shapes and the particles want to be within a 0.1 distance to each other and they're kind of trying to achieve this equilibrium, Houdini automatically spawns a lot less points than if I would go higher resolution here. But I have the option on the emission amount to oversample that. Now keep in mind, the solver doesn't care. The solver wants to achieve equilibrium between the point distances. which means automatically, well, we're making something that kind of looks like my fried egg this morning, right? It just blurs out and it becomes this big shape, and yeah, there's no more details in it, and that's just because we're emitting so many particles, all of which want to be a certain distance from each other, and that just pushes out to the sides, makes this whole thing a lot bigger, right? So unless you have a very good reason for it, I would just keep this up at 1. Velocity offset, you know, it's kind of like, don't change it too much, again, unless you have a specific case. Velocity multiplier, very nice, very important to have. Let's say you want to add a little bit more of a wow moment into your simulation and really crank up the whitewater and have it fly a lot faster and a lot further than your water sim. Crank up the velocity multiplier. Or if you need to achieve the opposite, where your whitewater is just going absolute mayhem, you know, crank down that velocity multiplier. Speed limit is fantastic. It's a cute little thing. And what it does, it basically removes all spikes. So if you have velocities on a point that shoot out forever and go really, really fast, well, sometimes you want to limit those back in, right? So this just won't allow any particle to be faster than whatever you set the value to here to begin with, right? Really nice to, oh, I have this one particle that flies away and goes crazy. You can just limit its speed here. And then lifespan, standard lifespan setting, it's a pop simulation, so this will live for 5 seconds, right? And then we have some advanced options down here. So if we look at those, we can change the seed, and then we have the same settings. One second. So here we have advanced, under the advanced settings, we have aging rates. So these are kind of extenders of the lifespan. So let's say you want your bubbles to live forever because you have this very underwatery, bubbly shot. You can just tell them to live a lot longer than the foam or the spray. Very nice feature, very good to have like some individual aging control over all of these areas. And down there you have a velocity noise in case all your particles go in the same direction and it's a bit boring, like we kind of have in this case, right? You can just add a little bit of a noise to all of that from the beginning, you know, messing this stuff up a bit. So if we add these guys, and now let's do something very little, we can see that we add this. So that we just break up those shapes just a tiny, right? Nothing too crazy. And now if we hit simulate, we see that everything is working just fine. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and I'm going to run this through at a little bit higher resolution with a little bit more whitewater scale. Up here, a little bit more lower whitewater scale, so that we can see what this guy does. Right, I'll be back. Okay, so we are back, and we've had some of the simulation run for 100 frames. Again, this is the same settings that we had, no changes, all default, and this is what we're getting. Right, it's just a bit more high resolution. So we can see that we're getting some nice foam patterns, we're getting all of that, and we're also getting our whitewater colliding with the edges of our simulation tank. So let's take a look at where that is happening, and we want to use that, seeing that it's going quite crazy over the corner. So if we go back into our whitewater simulation at work, and just for us to play around with stuff, I decrease the resolution again. And if we go to our whitewater solver, we get to limits, right? So limits, as we established before, well, has the big box that we turned off in the beginning. That's a bit annoying to look at. So if we enable that again, we can see that this box is defined and set up directly from our flip solver. So it's the same settings. Also our boundary conditions, like if they're closed or not, are being taken over directly from the flip object. So if we turn all of this off, now all the particles that go outside will just be killed, which is quite nice, right? That's probably something. So now let's turn these off again and look at the other option that we have in here in limits, and that is collision stop, right? we probably want to collide with some stuff just to make sure that the white water interacts correctly. So let's point this at our collision, the same one that we pointed our simulation to, and here it asks for the SDF name. So the easiest way to grab that is to go to our collision source. On the volume we see the name, and right now it's called collision. Again, it's Houdini, you could call this whatever you want, just grab the right name, go back to the whitewater solver and paste that. So now we will get collisions. Now let's go down further in the settings to forces. Now forces on the whitewater solver are interesting because they are described by two things: gravity and buoyancy. So gravity is the usual, it's what we're used to and all of that. Buoyancy describes how fast particles under the water surface rise towards the water surface, right? And there you kind of need to do a little bit of the math of like, they are being pushed down by minus 9.81, but they're rising by 13.08. So really they won't be rising 13 units per frame. They will be rising roughly 4.73 units per frame, right? Per second, not per frame, which is okay. And then when you scroll down, we have all of these confusing curves here. Now, these curves are described based off fit ranges. So, oops, I changed the value here. So the depth range here is sampling the SDF of our surface field. And up here is positive 8, down here is negative 0.8, positive 0.8, which gives us exactly at 0.5 our surface field, right? That's the middle of our surface. So here we can see this buoyancy curve means it starts dying off when it comes closer to the surface, and then it, gets pushed up a little bit more. And for the advection of our particles, that's again for everything underneath the water. How much of the velocity field should they be using? When they're really deep, not so much, because bubbles far underneath the water get affected less by the waves. We will be talking a lot more about that during the beach break lecture later in this workshop. And the closer to the surface level they get, the more they're advected, and then obviously as soon as they're away from the surface, they're falling off again. Now you might be wondering why these ramps don't stop right at 0.5, right? They're all kind of overshooting it by quite some bit. And that is because the foam layer also needs to be advected by the water surface. And if that's not being advected by the water surface, it will make weird streaking effects and everything kind of freaks out a little bit. So the side effects guys give it a little bit of a range, a little bit of a limit, just to make sure that all the foam is also being advected. Now the spray that's flying off of the surface and like hangs in the air and goes up, that leaves this little margin so fast that it doesn't make a difference, and this just helps clean up everything. So there's no risk applied with having that a little bit over the edge, right? So that is our forces, which means if you want your particles to rise a lot faster, increase the buoyancy. Slower, decrease the buoyancy, right? Simple stuff. But now the main section of the solver comes, and that is the shaping and the look and how things work and how they feel, and that is under foam. So here we have a bunch of settings for clumping, for erosion, and repellent. So I will be running a bunch of flipbooks with the same simulation we saw earlier, right? With these kind of settings, and I will be running a few different versions of this, and then I'll come back and we'll be talking about the results of that. Okay, so I ran a few of those simulations, and here's our default. So this is what we're having without any shaping changes, without anything what we had before I went off to simulate some things. And the only thing I changed here from the version before is run this through with the volume limits turned off so that our foam disappears. So the first setting under the foam options that we have is our lumping, right? So how strong do those particles want to be together? And here we can see, especially on the last frame, we have a few solo particles that are just floating around out here, over there, right? That are just not very neat and give us this more broken up foam pattern look. Now, if we run this with a lot more, how is it called? A lot more constrained stiffness on the clumping, then we see that we get all of the sudden very nice patterns in some areas. Like to compare these, we're at 47. Over here, like this is a lot more messy. Here we're getting a lot nicer, more defined details. Look at the last frame of this. We see that there's really not as many loose particles just floating around on the edges, right? We're getting nicer, bubbly spherical shapes. We're getting, a little bit of outbreak here, and we're getting this just to look a little bit neater and a little bit more fine. Now, too much clumping can obviously backfire and just remove a lot of the realism of the look, but I think a little bit more stiffness in the constraints will add quite a bit to your simulation. Right, so this is clumping. More clumping, cleaner, less clumping, a little bit more broken up. Right? So the next option here is erosion. So the way erosion works, it basically uses that density field that was generated at all times, right, of how many particles are active where, and uses that range density to slowly kill off particles. So if we look at what this looks with a quite heavy erosion setting, just so we see what happens, we can really see how this foam just dies off a lot quicker. And the reason is it's very low density areas here, right? It's high density, it's nice together, it's clumped, and now it becomes low density as these particles push further and further apart from each other, and now we're starting to kill those guys off. As the new foam comes in, spreads and dies off. So if you want to have like shorter lived foam that dies off in an organic manner and just not just over lifespan and everything dies off at the same time, using something like erosion might be a very nice go-to here. And the last option, that's really about sculpting. Adhesion is not about sculpting and making new shapes, is repellent. So again, this is our base simulation. And now if we look at our repellent simulation, base, why does it, sorry, this is the repellent simulation. So here we can see that the repellent adds a lot. It does make a massive difference to your simulation, right? Here we can see how the foam just spreads out now. It gets emitted, it moves with the surface, and now it just spreads out and all the strength takes over, which means in a lot of areas we're getting really blobby shapes. What we don't get anymore is these snaky behaviors, this kind of behavior of the foam being pushed together and squeezed and all of this, or like here randomly changing direction. So I personally always like to turn off repellent. It just means you need to play a lot more with your lifespan and with your shaping tools to make it work, right? So what repellent introduces is a bit of this more like stringy behavior on a big level, which can work quite nicely. It can also really backfire. But if you turn it off, that behavior disappears, and what you're left with is just all particles trying to reach equilibrium at their distance while floating around on the surface. That really covers all of the shaping tools that are there on the whitewater solver. What the last option here is adhesion. And adhesion simply tries to force the particles that are foam onto the water surface, right? As we can see here, these particles are floating on top of the surface level of these particles, right? So they're not going below every now and then and above, and they're not bouncing around. Adhesion simply says, hey, if you're within this range of depth, make sure you stick to the surface, right? Make sure that you're really trying to be as close as possible to that, which is nice. It just cleans up the simulation, removes that popping, and removes the chance of your whitewater being underneath the surface every now and then and then coming up above it. But that is whitewater simulations. That's what it does, and that's all really you need from those. So now let's take a quick look After the crash, I'll be right back with the scene opened up again. Alright, so we are back. And we have our flip simulation here. That comes in from a dot network. We're using a .io. That's all set up by Houdini already, this whole chain here. So this .io simply brings in our geometry. Now, the set density uses the density grid that was before with a bunch of values and everything to basically remap a density attribute onto the particles that we're simulating. The reason we are doing that is because whitewater in Mantra is completely rendered as volumes. So the way Houdini does that is by simply rasterizing those particles and using the density attribute to really derive the density of the smoke around, right? So if we have a denser area of particles, right here, for example, there's a lot of particles, right, compared to here. Our smoke will be a lot more dense over here than it is in the middle here, right? Now, the reason we're working with density and not so much like p-scale and making them smaller and all of that is just cohesiveness. All of these points try to achieve a certain distance to each other. So if we start playing around with p-scale and varying that based on how dense it is and all of that, it will just break apart and all of these single dots will become dots instead of one big nice area that works as a sheet of foam, right? Now, this can go directly to rendering and you render it and it looks good. But in order for us to get speculars on this within Mantra, Mantra needs something called a gradient field. So here within Houdini, it automatically just puts those down for you when you use the whitewater options. And that is a VDB combine, which just grabs the density field on 0 in case you combine this with something else, and then a gradient. And that gives you now the gradient of everything facing, like where do things face from our density field, which can be used in the shader to drive specularity. And those two combined, our density and the gradient, is what we're exporting for shading and what we're going to render. So in this video, we've covered the whitewater solver, how to dial in emissions, and how to make simulations that work, and how we can control them, how can we get different looks of them, and yeah, covering the basics of the whitewater solver. In the next video, we will be going over more of the settings of Flip rather than the basic tool sets. We've just covered how to do a basic simulation, how to do basic meshing, and how to do basic whitewater. Now that we have this trifactor of parts that go into a whitewater simulation, really, we're going to spend more time this week looking at the Flip solver itself, and we're going to talk about the different volume shaping options like viscosity, density, air entrapment, divergency, surface tension, and so on, and getting a deeper understanding of what all of these do so that we can then next week do some cool stuff. Thank you.